we're going to look at impulses and synapses, and we see how the electric impulse travels from one neuron to another through a synapse. So first, let's look at the membrane of a neuron. So the first thing we notice is the distribution of ions and how it is different from the inside versus the outside of the neuron. So I'm going to add the negative ions along with the positives. Here's the key. You can see the sodium ions and the potassium ions are the positive ones. And let's play, let's see what happens. Notice the movement of sodium across the sodium gate. This is the sodium gate that allows sodium. We have the potassium gate that allows potassium. And we have the sodium-potassium pump that pumps 3 sodiums with every 2 potassiums in one round. Now, the interesting thing about the sodium-potassium pump is that it uses energy in order to function. It works using active transport. So that's why you see ATP coming in, dissociating into ADP and an organic phosphate, and then leaving. And when it does this dissociation, it releases energy. So this is the general movement of these ions along the membrane of the neuron. And this movement in the bigger picture is going to cause the propagation of the electric impulse. So let's see if we give a weak stimulus along the axon, what happens? This is what happens. See these individual shifts? For example, here we have a shift, a depolarization, a shift in the polarity. So it's positive on the outside, negative on the inside. Suddenly at this area, the polarity shifts. It's negative on the outside, positive on the inside. This is because of the pumping of ions we saw earlier. And once these ions are pumped, and we have a depolarization here, it's going to stimulate the area right next to it to depolarize. And once it does depolarize this area, this previous area repolarizes. It goes back to being positive on the outside, negative on the inside. And so this is why it looks like the signal is jumping from one part of the membrane to the other. This is exactly what's happening, actually. So this is the propagation of the nervous message along the membrane of the neuron. And it is due to a series of depolarization and repolarization events. So when this message reaches the end of the neuron, how is it going to go to a different neuron? How are neurons going to stimulate each other? Because they are physically separated by a gap called the synapse. Well, along the synapse, we will have the release of neurotransmitters. So these neurotransmitters are here. These are chemicals that are going to signal to the second neuron that there is a message that it needs to transmit. These neurotransmitters are usually stored at the ends of neurons in the terminals inside of vesicles. Once the action potential reaches them, and then they travel along the synapse and reach the other neuron where they bind to receptors. And when they bind to receptors, they stimulate the propagation of the electrical message at the other neuron. And once their job is done, they can be broken down, they can be reabsorbed. Many different things happen to remove these neurotransmitters. We return to resting state. And then when another impulse arrives, the same thing happens again. And this is how the message is propagated from one neuron to another. And once this message reaches the other neuron, at the other neuron we will have the same thing we saw earlier. We will have this that happens, and when the message reaches the end of this neuron and it wants to transmit it to a third neuron, this happens along the synapse again. and so on. So this is the nerve impulse and the travel of the nervous message along a synapse.